Ambassador Zethara of the Vorik Empire was having what humans might call a really bad day, though she wouldn't know that particular phrase since she was currently convinced that humans were little more than glorified space janitors with delusions of diplomatic grandeur. She stood in the pristine corridors of diplomatic station harmony, which was about as harmonious as a symphony orchestra falling down a flight of stairs while someone played bagpipes in the background, watching her species' most precious cargo slowly waste away. The royal cubs of House Mordian were dying. Well, not dying exactly, but they were certainly putting on a spectacular performance of it that would make Broadway actors weep with envy. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel, that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. The three younglings each know bigger than a human child, but infinitely more important according to galactic law, and their own inflated sense of self-worth had refused every delicacy, every carefully prepared meal, every nutritional supplement that the station's finest chefs could produce. For 6 days now, they'd turned their elegant snouts up at offerings that would make a Michelin-starred restaurant weep with envy and possibly file a lawsuit for inadequacy. Perhaps, suggested Chief Culinary Officer Blenth, his forearms ringing nervously like he was trying to start an invisible campfire. If we tried the crystallized moon fruit with essence of nebula mist, garnished with stardust and served on plates made from compressed time itself, Zethara's violet fur bristled with the kind of frustration usually reserved for tax audits and furniture assembly instructions. They've rejected moon fruit 17 times. Blenth, along with starberries, nebula nectar, quantum quinoa, temporal tomatoes, interdimensional ice cream, and everything else in your apparently useless repertoire that sounds like it was named by a committee of pretentious food critics having a collective stroke. The cubs lay in their luxury suite, looking remarkably like very expensive, very stubborn throw rugs that had been blessed by ancient alien gods and subsequently developed attitude problems. Their breathing was shallow. Their usually lustrous fur had lost its shine like a sports car that hadn't been waxed in months, and their parents, the Duke and Duchess of Mordian, were sending increasingly frantic subspace messages demanding updates that Zethara really didn't want to provide. The kind of messages that started with polite inquiries and would inevitably escalate to threats involving orbital bombardments and strongly worded diplomatic protests. Your Excellency, Blenth ventured again, apparently having missed the memo about knowing when to quit while you're behind. Perhaps we should consider that they're simply homesick. Young Vorak often refuse food when separated from familiar environments. It's a documented psychological response that these are royal cubs. Zethara interrupted as if the word royal somehow contained magical nutritional properties and could solve problems through sheer aristocratic willpower. They cannot simply be homesick like common children who cry when their favorite blanket is in the wash. There must be something else, something we're missing, some cosmic conspiracy or ancient curse. That what they were missing, unfortunately, was currently 3 levels down in the station's less prestigious quarters, complaining loudly about the quality of the coffee while performing minor miracles with military-grade food substitutes. Lieutenant Marcus Chen of the Terran Diplomatic Corps was having his own version of a bad day, which mostly involved paperwork that seemed to reproduce when he wasn't looking, terrible coffee that could strip paint, and probably violated several interstellar treaties, and the growing suspicion that nobody actually read his carefully crafted reports about human-alien cultural integration challenges. He'd been stationed on Harmony for 8 months now, and in that time he'd mostly dealt with minor trade disputes that usually boiled down to your stuff costs too much, lost luggage complaints that invariably involved someone's pet being mistakenly shipped to a mining colony, and the occasional drunk Andromedian who thought the waste disposal chutes were some kind of revolutionary transportation system designed by forward-thinking engineers. "I'm telling you, Rodriguez," he was saying to his fellow lieutenant while stirring what could generously be called coffee if you squinted and had suffered recent head trauma, "these alien diplomats act like we're invisible half the time. That Vorik ambassador walked right past me yesterday like I was furniture, and not even good furniture. Like I was one of those cheap folding chairs that collapse when you look at them wrong." Lieutenant Elena Rodriguez, who had the uncanny ability to make even military rations taste edible through what Chen suspected was either advanced chemistry or actual witchcraft, was currently performing miracles with a packet of something labeled beef stew. Dehydrated, not fit for human consumption, but regulations say we have to call it food anyway, and legal says we can't use the word toxic. The actual label just said beef stew MRE, but Rodriguez maintained that truth in advertising was important, especially when dealing with food that had probably been invented during the dark ages of military catering. Maybe she was distracted, Rodriguez suggested with the kind of optimism that suggested she hadn't spent enough time dealing with alien bureaucracy, adding what appeared to be hot sauce to the mixture with the precision of a chemist working on something that might either cure diseases or create new ones. "I heard there's some kind of crisis with those Royal Cubs," third shift mentioned. "Something about them not eating, and you know how gossip travels on this station. By tomorrow, it'll be a story about alien cubs being possessed by ancient food demons." Chen nearly choked on his coffee, which was arguably an improvement since it distracted him from the taste. "Not eating, how is that our problem? We're human diplomats, not alien pediatric nutritionists." "It's not our problem," Rodriguez said, with a shrug that suggested she'd learn to pick her battles carefully. "But you know how the station commander gets about diplomatic incidents. If those cubs keel over on our watch, it's going to be a paperwork nightmare that makes tax season look like a relaxing vacation. Harrison will probably make us fill out forms about the forms we need to fill out about the incident reports." She had a point that was unfortunately both valid and terrifying. Commander Harrison had made it very clear during their orientation that their job was to maintain the lowest possible profile, while somehow also being prepared for any conceivable crisis up to and including alien invasion, diplomatic emergencies, and coffee shortages. It was the kind of contradictory order that only made sense to career military officers and people who designed instruction manuals for products that came with warnings not to eat them. Besides, Rodriguez continued tasting her creation and nodding approvingly, like a chef who just discovered a new Way to make cardboard palatable, kids. Are kids right, even alien royal kids, who probably have their own servants too. Tie their shoes and cut their food into fun shapes. Remember when my nephew refused to eat anything but chicken nuggets for 3 months? My sister was convinced he was going to develop scurvy or turn into a chicken. Chen was about to point out the obvious differences between human children and alien royalty, who probably had entire government departments dedicated to their dietary preferences when the station's intercom crackled to life with the kind of static that suggested the communication system had been designed by the lowest bidder. All available diplomatic personnel to Conference Room 7 Priority Alpha. Situation: this is not a drill, people. Repeat, this is not a drill, and yes, that includes the humans in the basement. Chen and Rodriguez exchanged the kind of glances that passed between people who suddenly realized their day was about to get significantly worse. Priority Alpha was the kind of rating usually reserved for things like incoming asteroid with hostile intentions, or someone accidentally declared war on somebody important, or the coffee machine is broken and the Andromedians are getting cranky. Conference Room 7 was packed with the kind of controlled chaos that suggested everyone was very important and very stressed about it, like a shareholders meeting where someone had just announced that the company's main product was being recalled due to it spontaneously combusting. Ambassador Zethara stood at the head of the table, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy, possibly including the inside of a black hole, while various other diplomats muttered in their respective languages about jurisdiction, protocol, and whose fault this was going to turn out to be. Commander Harrison, a woman who could make a drill sergeant feel inadequate, and probably had got straight to the point with a kind of military efficiency that suggested she'd rather be dealing with actual combat than diplomatic crisis. The situation is simple, people. The royal cubs of House Mordian are entering their 7th day of refusing all food. Their condition is deteriorating at a rate that has their parents sending us messages that are getting progressively less diplomatic. If they die on this station, the Vorak Empire will consider it an act of war. Chen felt his stomach drop somewhere around his boots while simultaneously trying to relocate to his throat. Rodriguez, on the other hand, was frowning thoughtfully with the expression she usually wore when she was trying to figure out how to make expired rations taste like actual food. An act of war, Harrison continued with the cheerful tone of someone delivering news about a terminal diagnosis that will implicate not just the station but Earth itself, since we're the managing authority here and apparently responsible for everything that goes wrong within a 50 light-year radius. The room erupted in what could diplomatically be called vigorous discussion, but was really just multilingual panic with a side order of finger pointing. Chen watched as various species pointed fingers, tentacles, and other appendages at each other with increasing vigor, like a bizarre game of charades where everyone was trying to mime, "It's not my fault," in 17 different languages. What about medical intervention? Someone suggested from the back. Probably someone who'd never dealt with alien physiology or medical malpractice. Lawsuits. Fourth act physiology is too delicate for force feeding, Ambassador Zeth Thor replied coldly with the tone of someone explaining why you couldn't fix a broken spaceship with duct tape and optimism. Any attempt could kill them faster than starvation, and then we'd have dead royal cubs and really angry parents with access to military weapons. Psychological counseling suggested. Another voice, apparently from someone who thought the solution to everything was talking about feelings. Their children not mentally ill. Zithara snapped, although at this point, I'm beginning to question the mental state of everyone in this room, perhaps. If we consulted with specialists from their home world, enough, Commander. Harrison's voice cut through the chaos, like a plasma cutter through butter, with similar results in terms of everyone immediately shutting up. I want solutions, not excuses. Every person in this room is going to contribute ideas, and we're going to implement them all if necessary, no matter how ridiculous they sound. I don't care if someone suggests we dance naked around a bonfire while chanting ancient recipes. If it might work, we're trying it, which was how 2 hours later, after what could generously be called brainstorming and more accurately described as controlled desperation, Chen found himself standing outside the Cubs' luxury suite with Rodriguez, both of them carrying standard issue MREs and wondering how their careers had taken such a surreal turn that they were now apparently alien child nutritionists. I still think this is insane, Chen muttered, adjusting his dress uniform for the 5th time, because apparently looking professional was important when you were about to potentially start an interstellar war with military rations. We're going to walk in there and offer royal alien children food that most humans complain about. Insane ideas are the only ones left, Rodriguez replied cheerfully, with the kind of optimism that suggested she either had complete confidence in her plan or had completely lost her mind. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We could start an interstellar war, get court-martialed, spend the rest of our lives in military prison, and go down history as the humans who killed alien royalty with beef stew. Only if we're really bad at this, Rodriguez said, apparently unbothered by the prospect of historical infamy. The Cub suite was about the size of Chen's entire apartment back on Earth, decorated what he assumed was the height of Orthac luxury, but looked to his human eyes like someone had let a particularly wealthy alien with questionable taste loose in a furniture store with unlimited credit. Everything was purple and gold and looked like it cost more than his annual salary, possibly more than his lifetime earnings if you included interest and inflation. The Cubs themselves were curled up on what appeared to be beds made of crystallized starlight or possibly very expensive alien materials that just looked mystical, looking pitiful and expensive, like luxury pets who developed existential depression. Their small forms barely made impressions in the elaborate bedding, and their breathing was so shallow that Chen had to look carefully to make sure they were still alive. Ambassador Zithara hovered nearby, like a particularly well-dressed thundercloud with diplomatic credentials, radiating the kind of tension usually associated with diffusing bombs or parallel parking in tight spaces. I cannot believe we've been reduced to this, she said, her voice dripping with disdain thick enough to spread on toast. Asking humans for help with something as basic as feeding children. What next? Consulting with Andromedians about proper sanitation, with respect. Your Excellency, Chen said, managing to keep his tone diplomatic despite the urge to point out that maybe if alien cuisine wasn't so ridiculously complicated, they wouldn't be in this mess. Our children are usually pretty good at eating when they're hungry. It's one of those basic survival instincts that evolution tends to favor. Zekthara's violet eyes narrowed with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who just suggested that perhaps the problem was overthinking things. These are not ordinary children, Lieutenant. They are royalty. They have been raised on the finest delicacies in the galaxy, foods prepared by master chefs who train for decades to achieve perfection. They cannot simply be expected to eat whatever it is you've brought in those ridiculous packages. Rodriguez was already kneeling next to the smallest cub, a little female who couldn't have been more than 7 in human years but was apparently important enough to cause interstellar incidents. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice taking on the universal tone that adults use with sick children everywhere in the galaxy, the one that somehow transcends species barriers. "My name's Alina. What's yours?" The cub's ears twitched slightly, the first sign of responsiveness they'd shown in days, but she didn't open her eyes. It was progress, though, which was more than anyone else had achieved. "This is Princess Mira," Zethara said stiffly, with a kind of formal introduction usually reserved for heads of state or people being presented to royalty, and those are Prince Jorik and Prince Kyle. They are the future of House Mordian and the hope of their people right now. They're just kids who won't eat," Rodriguez said with the kind of practical assessment that probably gave diplomats nightmares, unpacking one of the MREs with practiced efficiency. "And sometimes kids need different kinds of encouragement than adults expect." Chen watched, fascinated despite himself and his growing certainty that they were about to become footnotes in a very embarrassing chapter of military history. As Rodriguez began opening the meal pack with practiced efficiency, the process was hardly elegant. MREs were designed for functionality under combat conditions, not aesthetics or diplomatic presentations, but there was something almost ritualistic about the way she laid out each component, like a chef preparing ingredients for a cooking show aimed at people who appreciated efficiency over artistry. "What?" Zechara asked with obvious horror in the tone of someone who just witnessed a violation of natural law. "Is that combat rations?" Rodriguez replied cheerfully, activating the heating element with a small hiss that sounded remarkably loud in the hushed luxury of the suite. Specifically, today's menu appears to be, let's see, chicken pesto pasta and beef patty with barbecue sauce, plus the usual accessories. She held up packets of crackers, cheese spread, and what might generously be called chocolate if you were feeling optimistic about food labeling. "You want to feed the royal cubs military rations?" Zechathatara's voice climbed several octaves, reaching frequencies that probably violated noise ordinances on several planets. "Food designed for soldiers, for combat situations, for people who are trying not to die rather than enjoying a proper meal. I want to feed 3 hungry kids some food," Rodriguez corrected with the patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with panicked adults before. The military rations part is just a technicality. Food is food and hungry is hungry. The heating element activated with a small hiss, and suddenly the room filled with an aroma that was actually Not terrible, which was high praise for MREs and probably exceeded everyone's expectations. Chen had eaten his share of MREs over the years during training exercises and field deployments, and while they weren't exactly gourmet cuisine or likely to win any awards, the newer versions were substantially better than their reputation suggested. They'd come a long way from the dark days when soldiers joked that the meals were designed to be equally unpalatable. Whether eaten hot or cold, something remarkable happened. Princess Mira's nose twitched, not much, just a small movement. But in the context of 6 days of complete unresponsiveness, it might as well have been a symphony orchestra. Then Prince Jorik cracked open one golden eye, peering at the strange human and her mysterious packages with a kind of curiosity that suggested his survival instincts hadn't been completely overwhelmed by royal protocol. Prince Kale actually lifted his head, which was more movement than he'd shown since the hunger strike began. Impossible. Zathara breathed, staring at the cub like they just performed actual magic. Rodriguez grinned with the satisfaction of someone whose ridiculous plan was actually working, and kept working, stirring the pasta and laying out crackers with cheese spread with the kind of casual efficiency that made it look effortless. She opened a packet of what claimed to be fruit drink but looked like industrial coolant mixed with food coloring and began humming softly under her breath some tune that Chen didn't recognize, but that seemed to fill the space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating elements. The secret, she said, glancing at Chen with the expression of someone sharing professional knowledge, isn't the food. It's making it feel like an adventure instead of a chore. She was right, Chen realized with the kind of clarity that usually came too late to be useful. There was something about the informal, almost campfire-like atmosphere Rodriguez was creating that was completely different from the formal ceremonial approach everyone else had tried. Instead of treating the cubs like precious artifacts who needed to be carefully maintained and preserved, she was treating them like, well, like kids, like small people who might respond to inclusion and curiosity rather than ceremony and protocol, who wants to try something that actual space explorers eat. Rodriguez asked the cubs directly, completely ignoring Zathara's sharp intake of breath and the kind of diplomatic protocol that usually governed interactions with royalty. Prince Kyle, apparently the boldest of the three, or possibly just the hungriest, sat up completely for the first time in days. Space explorers. Absolutely, Rodriguez said with complete sincerity and the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for describing epic adventures. This is the same food that human crews eat when they're months away from any planet, exploring new star systems and having adventures in places where nobody has ever been before. It's designed to keep you strong and healthy, even in the most dangerous places in the galaxy. When you can't go to a restaurant or call for takeout, Chen had to admire her approach, which was either brilliant psychology or the kind of inspired improvisation that sometimes worked better than careful planning. She'd managed to reframe military rations as something exotic and adventurous instead of institutional and bland, turning necessity into excitement. The cubs were all sitting up now, their earlier lethargy replaced by obvious curiosity in the first sparks of interest they'd shown in anything other than sleeping. But Princess Mira said, Hesitantly, her voice small and uncertain. It smells different, not like our food. Different can be good, Rodriguez said gently, offering her spoonful of the pasta with the patience of someone who understood that small steps were still steps forward. How do you know if you like something if you never try it? Some of the best things in the universe are different from what we expect. Mira looked at the spoon, then at Zethara, who was standing frozen like someone had turned her into a very expensive statue with excellent posture. Then back at Rodriguez, who was smiling encouragingly without pushing or demanding. And she took a bite. The silence in the room was deafening, the kind of quiet that preceded either celebration or catastrophe. Chen held his breath. Rodriguez watched hopefully, and Zethara looked like she might faint or possibly spontaneously combust from stress. The other two cubs watched their sister with intense fascination, as if she were conducting a scientific experiment that might determine the fate of the universe. Mira chewed thoughtfully, her expression serious and concentrated, swallowed carefully, and then said the words that would probably be referenced in diplomatic history books for the next century. It's good. Chaos erupted, but it was good chaos, the kind that came from relief and surprise rather than panic. Prince Jorik immediately demanded his own spoonful with the kind of enthusiasm that had been missing for days, while Prince Kale wanted to know if all human food tasted like this and whether there were other flavors. Rodriguez, clearly in her element and probably enjoying herself more than she should have been, began distributing portions while explaining the finer points of MRE preparation with the enthusiasm of a teacher who'd found engaged students. The trick with the cheese spread, she was saying while the cubs hung on her every word like she was revealing the secrets of the universe, is to mix it with the crackers while it's still warm from the heating element. The heat makes it spread better, and your mouth thinks the crackers taste fresher. And this chocolate bar isn't actually chocolate, it's some kind of chocolate-flavored food product that was probably invented by people who'd heard chocolate described but never actually tasted it. But if you eat it with a fruit drink, your brain gets confused and thinks it tastes better than it actually does. The cubs hung on her every word, eating with an enthusiasm that made Zethara's earlier panic seem not just absurd, but almost insulting to their intelligence. They asked questions about Earth, about human space travel, about what other kinds of food humans ate when they weren't exploring. Rodriguez answered them all with the kind of patience that suggested she'd dealt with curious children before and actually enjoyed it. Why do humans eat this when they're far from home? Prince Jorik wanted to know, apparently having decided that understanding human psychology was important, because sometimes, Rodriguez said, her voice taking on a more serious tone that suggested she was sharing something genuinely important. When you're doing something important, something that matters, you can't always have perfect food, but you can have food that keeps you strong and reminds you that someone cared enough to make sure you wouldn't go hungry, even in the middle of nowhere. Chen felt something tighten in his chest at the simple sincerity of her answer, the way she'd managed to find profound meaning in something as mundane as military rations. There was something genuinely moving about watching these alien children discover that food could be about more than just luxury or perfection, that it could be about care, practicality, and connection between people who might never meet but still looked out for each other. This is. Zechara began, then stopped apparently, unable to find words adequate for what she was witnessing. This is kids being kids, Chen said quietly, watching Princess Mira carefully examine cracker before deciding it met her approval. Even royal kids, by the time the cubs had finished their first full meal in a week, they were chattering excitedly about everything from human spaceships to the ingenious design of MRE heating elements, their earlier lethargy completely replaced by the kind of enthusiasm that only well-fed children could maintain. Princess Mira had claimed the chocolate bar is her favorite discovery, while the princes were fascinated by the efficiency of the packaging and wanted to know if humans always made their food so convenient. When we get home, Prince Ka announced with the certainty of someone making important plans, I want to tell Father about Space Explorer food, and I want to know if our kitchens can make food like this. He probably won't believe you, Rodriguez said with a grin. That suggested she understood exactly how adults would react to this story. Adults sometimes have trouble believing that the best solutions can be the simple ones. Later, after the cubs had been settled back into their beds, this time for actual sleep rather than dramatic starvation, Chen and Rodriguez found themselves in the corridor with a thoroughly bewildered Vorik ambassador who looked like she was reconsidering everything she thought she knew about humans, children, and the universe in general. I don't understand, Zethara said, shaking her head with the expression of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. How did combat Rations succeed where the finest cuisine in the galaxy failed? How did two humans with military food accomplish what teams of master chefs could not? Rodriguez shrugged with the kind of casual wisdom that came from experience. Kids don't care about fine cuisine, Your Excellency. They care about stories, adventures, and feeling included in something bigger than themselves. All those fancy meals you were offering, they probably felt like medicine or punishment, something they had to endure. But sharing a meal with someone who treats you like a person instead of a precious object, that's different. But the nutritional content, surely military rations cannot compare to carefully prepared, is actually pretty good. Chen interrupted, deciding this was important enough to risk diplomatic protocol. MREs are designed to keep people healthy under extreme conditions, sometimes for weeks at a time. They might not be gourmet, but they're balanced, complete, and they work. Zethar was quiet for a long moment, processing this information and probably having to reconcile it with everything she'd been taught about humans and their supposed limitations. Finally, she said, I may have underestimated humans. Most species do, Rodriguez said cheerfully, apparently unbothered by casual xenophobia. We are used to it. It comes with the territory of being the new species in the neighborhood. But how do I explain this to their parents? How do I tell the Duke and Duchess that their children were saved by military rations, by food designed for soldiers? Chen and Rodriguez exchanged glances that conveyed several conversations worth of understanding. Maybe, Chen suggested carefully, you don't lead with that part. Maybe you focus on how human diplomatic specialists used innovative nutritional solutions to address a complex cultural adaptation challenge. Zthara's eyes widened slightly with what might have been the beginning of appreciation for human diplomatic creativity. That's actually quite clever. Diplomacy is half problem-solving and half creative writing, Rodriguez added with a wisdom that suggested she'd learned this lesson the hard way. The trick is knowing which half to use when the crisis, as it turned out, had a happy ending that satisfied everyone except the station's paperwork requirements, which somehow multiplied rather than diminished. Despite the successful resolution, the cubs continued eating human rations with enthusiasm, supplemented by carefully selected items from their traditional diet. Their parents, when they arrived 3 days later, were initially horrified and then grudgingly impressed when they saw their children healthy, happy, and full of stories about their adventure with the space explorers who shared their food. Duke Mordian, an imposing figure who looked like he could intimidate a small moon, and probably had during his military service, had pulled Chen aside during the formal reception. Lieutenant, he had said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that moved mountains and reorganized solar systems. My children tell me you and your colleagues saved their lives. We just shared our lunch, Your Grace, Chen had replied, because sometimes the truth really was that simple, even when it sounded inadequate. Indeed, Duke had studied him for a moment with eyes that seemed to catalog everything, from his posture to his probable psychological profile. You know, for decades we've heard stories about human ingenuity, about your species' remarkable ability to find simple solutions to complex problems. I always assumed they were exaggerated, and now I'm wondering what other assumptions I should be reconsidering. The formal diplomatic conclusion was that the incident had been a successful example of interspecies cooperation and cultural exchange that would serve as a model for future diplomatic challenges. The unofficial conclusion, whispered in the corridors of Harmony Station for months afterward and probably destined to become the kind of legend that grew with each telling, was that sometimes the best diplomacy happened over a shared meal, even if that meal came from a foil pouch with heating instructions and warnings about shelf life. Rodriguez received a commendation and a request from the Vorek Empire for a comprehensive guide to human field nutrition, which she was apparently taking seriously enough to research the cultural implications of military rations across different human societies. Chen got promoted to senior liaison, a position that mostly involved explaining human behavior to confused aliens and vice versa, which turned out to be surprisingly similar to his previous job, but with better pay and more interesting problems. And the royal cubs, they returned to their home world with a new appreciation for adventure, collection of MRE recipes, and a standing request for regular shipments of Space Explorer food that had their palace chefs convinced they developed some kind of exotic dietary requirement. Ambassador Zethara's final report to the Vorek High Council was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that managed to make military rations sound like a carefully planned cultural intervention designed to demonstrate human resourcefulness and interspecies cooperation. She also, though she never admitted it publicly, kept a small supply of human MREs in her office for particularly difficult negotiations, having discovered that sometimes the threat of feeding difficult diplomats military Rations was surprisingly effective. There's something to be said, she had confided to Chen during their final meeting, for food that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. That's very philosophical, Your Excellency. Humans, she had replied, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, have a talent for making philosophy out of practicality. 6 months later, when the Vorek Empire signed their first major trade agreement with Earth, the signing ceremony featured a reception where, alongside the traditional delicacies of both world, servers offered small portions of various human field rations. The dish was listed on the formal menu as Terran expedition cuisine and was surprisingly popular, leading to what food historians would later call the Great MRE Renaissance of 2387. The Cubs, now healthy and notorious throughout their sector for their unusual culinary adventures, sent regular messages to Rodriguez asking about new human foods and sharing stories of their own diplomatic missions. Princess Mira had become particularly fascinated with the concept of comfort food and was working on a scholarly paper about the psychological implications of military nutrition that was apparently destined to revolutionize alien understanding of human psychology. You know what the funny thing is? Rodriguez had said to Chen as they watched the news coverage of the trade signing. All we did was treat some kids like kids instead of like tiny adults. But somehow that turned into a major diplomatic breakthrough. Maybe, Chen had replied, that says something about how complicated we make things that should be simple, or maybe it says something about how powerful simple kindness can be when nobody expects it. They were both right, of course. In the grand sweep of galactic history, the incident would be remembered as the moment when humanity's reputation shifted from useful maintenance species to surprisingly effective diplomatic partners. But for the people involved, it was simpler than that. It was the day when some hungry kids got fed, some adults learned not to overthink everything, and the universe got a little bit smaller and more connected. And really, when you got right down to it, that was what the best diplomacy was all about, helping people understand that despite all their differences, they weren't so different after all. They all wanted to be safe, fed, understood, and treated with basic dignity, even if sometimes it took combat rations to figure that out. The end.